Right now, the conversation around stablecoins is chaotic. Most of the energy gets sucked into the regulation or the CBDC black hole that our entire industry currently orbits around. Maybe if you're in the right circles, you can find gimmicky or domain specific threads to pick apart, but it definitely requires looking. Today's guest, OneTrueKirk, is one of the best people to talk about the entire domain of stablecoins, soup to nuts. Not only does he have deep experience in crypto and actually building stablecoins, he's been spending the bear market thinking about questions that will directly inform the next generation of stablecoins. How do you need to rethink collateral given the volatile nature of DeFi? How do the latest innovations in governance come together with stablecoin design? And what does a mature stablecoin industry mean for Ethereum and for this world? If you're someone who is interested in the most important, most stable primitive in DeFi, you will love this conversation. One more thing before we begin, please do not take financial advice from this or any other podcast. Ethereum will change the world one day, but you can easily lose all of your money between now and then. All right, let's get on to the show. Kirk, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. Always happy to talk shop and ramble on about the things that I'm researching at any moment or finding interesting. So yeah, thank you for having me.
No, awesome. Well, we're definitely going to get to that portion, but before we do, I'm a big believer that that as cool as the tech is, what's even more important are like the people that choose to, belly up to it and like dedicate their lives and their careers to it. And so, at least half this conversation, I want to hear like, who are you, Kirk, and like, what's your story and what brought you to Ethereum?
Well, as you might notice from my manner of speaking or writing, I'm kind of an academic bent, and I come to this from a sort of a history and an economics perspective. That's what I studied in school, but I was also always close to, STEM sciences and especially space. And I was really into. My friend and I started a robotics club in college, and I got to know a lot of programmers that way, and eventually thought, well, maybe I could try that too. Basically realized that getting hands-on and building stuff was a lot more fun than purely being stuck writing about it. It is interesting to read and write about stuff, and I'm a big believer in having a first principles and theoretical, complete understanding of systems. But at a certain point, you get stuck and think, well, I could never make these kind of changes in TradFi. And I used to always get frustrated watching, whatever might be happening in politics or economics or the Fed was doing, and be like, well, why are they doing this? And I feel like I, who am even a non-expert, might be able to have some insight into it. And just to think that you can't get a grip on anything, right? Or have traction anywhere. It's so hard. Everything is closed, right? In TradFi, you have to go through a certain path to get anywhere. And so through learning to code, I got more hands-on with things. And that is also how I learned about, Bitcoin and Ethereum and the things that were getting started. And I wasn't like super early to these things. It was probably around like 2014 that I bought my first Bitcoin, I think.
I mean, you're pretty early.
No, but I mean, not like but even then I didn't fully grasp its significance. You know what I mean? It was only like purely like, I saw people use crypto when I was in high school to do like, purchase things on the internet. We'll leave it at that. I didn't use it in that way myself. And so it wasn't until I was in college that I bought any, and even still, the significance of a Turing complete, system like Ethereum eluded me until later. But once I really understood that, and it was once I saw MakerDAO that it really became clear to me what was possible to, and I understood how DAI worked.
I'm very interested in when you like first heard the call of the world computer. It sounds like it was around MakerDAO, but what was going on with you and in your life between like 2014 when you first like at least understood that there's something to mess around with, and then MakerDAO was like 2018, right? 17 maybe. Like what were you doing in the meantime?
Well, so after I graduated, I started working as a programmer, doing all kinds of different things, wherever I could get my hands on some work. And one of the things that I was really interested in was censorship resistance and decentralized computing. And I got into learning about some things like Althea network and also Urbit. which you probably have heard of. And it was through Urbit that I really got fully into Ethereum. Actually, that was kind of my starting point. MakerDAO was what made me realize I had to work on this, right? But Urbit was what first got me thinking, oh, I could learn how to write a smart contract. And because I became friends with some people who were working on Urbit, including Philip Monk, who was one of the developers at Tlon. And I had gone to San Francisco just for a conference that actually my wife was going to for work. And I happened to, I hit them up and said, hey, could I stop by the Tlon offices and just talk to you guys, learn about Urbit? And in that conversation, he said, you should really learn Solidity because it would be hard for you to get any work doing Urbit stuff, right? But you can definitely potentially get some work doing Solidity things. And because they use like these identity NFT registries, right? For anyone listening, they're pretty simple. They're a whole like peer-to-peer networking protocol, but they do ownership of the namespace on Ethereum. So that's a fairly simple smart contract and tractable where I could start, get started with it and understand it. And I tried writing some extensions for Urbit related stuff to kind of dip my toes in the water. And in doing all that, I learned fully about MakerDAO and DAI and how to actually use Ethereum and was trying it out. And that's when I thought, okay, I have to actually just get a job working at some company in this space to fully learn. And so I started out, I got a job at a startup that at the time was trying to build a cross-chain non-custodial decentralized exchange. You could say that their goals were in some sense analogous to Thorchain. But with the difference being that they were sort of had kind of a compliance first mindset of like, it's non-custodial. So like we want to architect it so like all the market makers can easily trade on it and not worry about their compliance. And there was some things to do with that I won't go into too much because in the end, well, I learned a lot about the difficulties of like different layers and trust assumptions, and came to conclude that the task that I was working on was impossible, right? And to do it trust minimized in the way that we wanted to.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like the story of this industry is like the vision is always like 7 or 8 steps above like what the technology can allow at the moment you have the vision. And oh my God, just to like go back and watch like the 2014 videos of Vitalik talking about Ethereum and to like just now be getting to some of those things, it like really blows your mind, right? But sorry, just to like scoot back to the your MakerDAO moment. Like, what was it about that? Like, are you like, I kind of hope I know the answer because like I think people are drawn to Ethereum for a lot of different reasons, right? And like some of it's about like economic reasons, and some of it's about like the like existential things around the economics, like censorship resistant, like that kind of stuff. Some people it's about like the computer science, like some people it's about the NFTs or like whatever. We can come up with one's reasons, but like when you let's say minted your first DAI, like what was it in that moment that where you're just like, oh my God?
Well, I think for me, a lot of it comes out of a lifelong. The reason that I wanted to study history and economics is this desire to know why the world ticks the way that it does, right? Why do people do the jobs they do and get paid what they do, and why are some people rich and others poor? And there's many answers for these kind of things, and any simple answer is wrong. But the the key to me is that the fundamental way that systems work, as far as like how property rights are organized and how money systems and interest rates are determined, are very important for these kind of outcomes. And so trying to understand all that is a long-term obsession, and seeing that these kind of debates that scholars have throughout a century of like how could we automate the Federal Reserve, what should the Fed really do, how should banks work, and the idea of MakerDAO was like, wait, someone had an idea about how money should work and they just put it right into practice, right there it is, and I can go and use it, and to me that was magic. And it's not that I didn't really even have a super strong use case to need to use a stablecoin. In the sense that like, since they're not readily, certainly at that time and even now, are not very usable for payments, right, in my day-to-day life. But I could see how they could be used for those things, right? And so I could see right away, right, this is, if you could get people to use this, it can replace so much of the annoying infrastructure that exists in banks, and it's much easier to deploy a smart contract than to write new laws, or to create a trustworthy. And as hard as it is to audit a code, it's a lot harder to build a trustworthy banking institution in the real world. So there's a lot of things you can do to try and experiment and push the envelope, and so that was very attractive for me.
Yeah, and I think too, like the reality of like I am a huge just believer in the importance of history, and like a huge believer that um, it's like important to recognize that everything single thing on this planet at this point in 2023 is this way because at some point somebody decided it was going to be like that. And like that's super powerful because it means that like everything doesn't have to be, and like, you know, there's space to explore all this new stuff. And you know, we don't need to go like that philosophical, but
And I'll add one more thing to this story, which is besides the maker moment, the other critical moment for me was my Uniswap moment, which is that at this time I was working on this decentralized exchange startup, and the narrative at this time was like decentralized exchanges can't scale, right? It's like the bandwidth of L1 trades will never be sufficient, and so the whole thing we were trying to do is this independent like chain or thing to do it, right? So it's like you can never have decentralized exchange on Ethereum will never be enough, right? The centralized exchange volume dwarfs it. It's always going to be that way. But as I was working, I saw decentralized exchange volume grow and grow and grow. And finally, they released Uniswap v3. And when I saw that, I just said to myself, oh my gosh, not only is this design space on chain not fully explored yet, it's not even close to fully explored, right? And I said that I need to spend way more time understanding everything about this from first principles, and I have to quit my job. And so I did, like a month later. And just I had enough of a little bull run nest egg, you know, to equal like 6 months of income or so. So I could felt confident in saying to my wife, let me quit my job and I need to work on this and maybe eventually either work at a new company or maybe start something. I don't know. And so that kind of launched me off. And so scaling as an issue has been at the core of it for a long time. You know, to me, credit and money is like even further back foundational, but it is early. You know, so it's a topic near and dear to my heart about like, how do you actually scale settlement and exchange?
A quick little anecdote from like my pre-crypto. And by the way, it's just very funny to hear you say that you had like 6 months of income and you felt like that was like relatively like work. And it's just like, welcome to crypto. I can tell your brain was already like changed by crypto if you thought 6 months was a long time. But anyway, so before I found crypto in 2021 because I heard Hayden Adams explain Uniswap on a Bloomberg podcast, and you know, that like we can talk about why but just like the ability for like anyone to create a market, and like I don't know if anyone will trade on it, but like it exists, was like that was my my moment where I was just like, I need to drop everything to figure this out. But before that, I was working for Anheuser-Busch, you know, which is like Budweiser, Bud Light, and it's like by far the largest beer company, and it's the second largest consumer products good company in the world. And one of my jobs was I was the cash manager for the U.S. and Canada, and so that's like $20 billion a year, which is like, you know, just had to make sure it was there to pay the bills and, you know, whatever, everything that entails. And like my favorite story of like why crypto is like inevitable, why like Ethereum is like inevitable, is so one year we had like a $1.45 billion tax payment, and so like it was one wire transfer for like billions of dollars, right? And so the CFO that day, he walks behind me, pulls up a chair, puts it behind my desk, and he goes, Rex, I'm going to sit here until it clears. Like, this is so important that like I just like need to know that it happens. And so for 8 hours that day, I sat there calling the bank every like 30 minutes and going like, hey, where's the wire? And every single time they're like, Rex, like, you know how this works. Like, it's a black box. Like, parts of it are different settlement banks. Like, we're waiting on liquidity. Like, it'll get there. Like, this is just how the system works. Like, we tell you this every 30 minutes. And then I would hang up the phone and say, like, they're working on it. Like, I'd make up stuff to give them updates. And then I'd go and, like, you know, look up, like, the price of aluminum on my Bloomberg terminal, or just, like, make shit up while the CFO is behind me, you know? And, like, for all of you who's never done like 9+ figure wire transfers, like, this is the system that runs the world today. And you know, like, we can talk about like decentralized finance and like the like scaled world computer and like all these things that are going to be enabled by like light clients and dank sharding and blah 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 blah. But just like on money transfer, like practical use, like it's such a better solution than what we have today. That yeah, I don't know, like. I think like on first principles, like that's where I start with Ethereum.
Well, I find that quite relevant given that I was on the receiving end of being debanked by Chase not long ago and faced quite a bit of trouble wiring the funds out. They canceled any outgoing wires to Circle. They were just said pretty much, when I talked to the customer representative, they said, "I'm sorry, I don't know why. There's no way for me to find out why, and you won't be able to get any resolution or answer before they close the account, so you'd better get to a branch and just get a check." And they said, "Sorry."
So in last year in summer, like while we're all like worried about our crypto lives, so I got locked out of all of my money from Wells Fargo. And get this, completely unrelated to crypto. Completely unrelated to crypto. But for like 5 months, I didn't have access to any of my liquidity.
5 months?
Yeah, and it was just like so ridiculous, and they were just passing me around, and I still don't have resolution, but I have my money. It resulted in me like dropping to minimum payments on all my credit cards. Like I ended up taking 5-figure loans from my mom, and like, a huge part about what crypto is to me is like control over my money. And like when you're dealing with Chase, when you're dealing with Wells Fargo, when you're dealing with any size bank, it's just they don't care about your life. They don't care if you're going to miss your mortgage. Like they don't care if like by closing this down, like the like very real life that you have built up and are counting on is like going to get screwed up. And like what crypto is like the ability to say like, well, it doesn't really matter if no one cares.
Yeah, I assert my right to due process, basically. You can't, like, sure, Circle could freeze my account, but not arbitrarily and without explanation, right? And it's undeniable proof that they've done it, right? Like it's a public action that everyone can see, and they can definitely get in trouble if they do it to a lot of people for no good reason. And so it's not perfect, but even a centralized stablecoin like that is a lot better than a bank like this where it's just my word, right? And what can I do, right? Nothing. It's probably in the terms and conditions, right? It's hard to even start like a public outcry. But if you could say, look, check the chain, they're freezing all these people. That's something.
Yeah, and like in on chain, we have options that are not even like centralized, and like USD has its problems, but like literally, unless you're like a Russian oligarch, like your size can probably be held in LUSD, right? Or like you could take a long position in ETH or like whatever. But like point is that like we have options.
There's a paradox where being able to defend it against attack decreases the odds where you will have to. Perhaps a paradox is the wrong word, but I think that's a positive thing, and that sometimes people talk, and even I will talk about the scaling constraints of certain systems. So that doesn't mean they're not valuable, right? And giving these kind of perhaps not fully scalable but available refuges still increases the overall security in my mind.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack there, but let's just continue on with this story. So we talked about how you were at this, like cross protocol decentralized exchange, and you realized that like love them, but like it just wasn't going to happen. And so like what are the next steps, and like can you just basically walk us from there to where we are today?
Well, I knew that the problem space I wanted to tackle was related to stablecoins, credit, lending, that sort of thing. And so I saw that Uniswap v2 to Uniswap v3, the key difference was that it was much more expressive for the LPs. It allows a lot more user preference in the defining the price relationships. And of course, as many others have noted, you could go with that, right? And there's other designs where people think about, well, what about different types of orders, right? Or different types of this and that. And there's lots of complexity you can do. But my mind started to go in a slightly different direction, because that's kind of the opposite of a stablecoin, right? Like what a stablecoin is a thing where you evaluate it up front and then you opt into a stable something, right? And all stablecoins are essentially synthetics, right? It's a synthetic debt asset of some kind or another, right? Backed by different things and governed by different rules. But the key thing when we say a stablecoin is that some set of rules and policies have to make it stable, and that's not each individual user independently managing that risk and liquidity fully on their own, and needing to like set ranges of prices and all those kinds of things. So that brings in kind of a governance problem. And so besides the scalability question of like, how do we let more users express their preferences directly on chain, we also have to say, well, what about the users who don't want to express their preferences too explicitly and have to actively manage things, and instead have some kind of a replacement for the kind of passive financial instruments that exist in TradFi, but without the same kind of centralized intermediaries? And how can we have governance but without reintroducing these trust assumptions? And I saw that, again, from very early on in Ethereum, people have spoken out against token, 51% token voting. Right, Vitalik is always ragging on it, but I felt that there weren't that many credible alternatives in terms of how you could make a stablecoin system work. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that problem. And at first, I was more focused on kind of the reflexor style autonomous control systems, but I started to come to the conclusion that it's the computational difficulty of the problem of like there's no set of inputs that can fully explain how you should lend, right, and risk and everything and interest. There's no like smart contract where you could fully describe all the things you should consider at all times in the market and at all future times to evaluate it. And so instead, you need to have like a rule set.
Yeah, to elaborate on that a little bit, so I'm sure if you've been on Twitter in the last week, you've like been aware of the Michael Curve, a CRV token Aave situation. And like one of the things that like really blew my mind through this conversation was realizing that whether it's Michael or people like him, that it's not only this massive position in Aave, but it's also in Abracadabra and in Fraxland. And so like my thought is like, how can any individual lending protocol like compensate not only for like, the price and liquidity of a token, but also like the structure of like where that token is in DeFi and like you're basically taking on systemic risks that like you're not acknowledging. And like I guess I just totally hear you in that like forget worrying about it from like a gas perspective, just from like a theoretical perspective, like how do you like handle the computation that like at the end of the day in TradFi, the way we do it is just like loan officers and gut checks.
In the end of the day, some human has to make the decision, right? And so it's my take that human can't be entirely removed, right? And that even in systems like LUSD and RAI, there's a Chainlink Oracle, right? There's someone who is running a computer program that observes the results of an API feed that comes from an exchange and computes a price and submits it at a particular time, right? And so that process is manipulable in certain ways. Like the Avi style attack could be done on any kind of asset or market that's reading in Chainlink type feeds. The only question is like how much leverage is there against that asset and how deep is the spot market? How profitable is it to manipulate, or even if not manipulate, as in the current situation, right, where it's like the price doesn't account for what would happen if you had to liquidate the position, and so it's like the price isn't that meaningful. So in the Michael case, it's not to rag on him in any way, but it's more like people don't just don't understand the nature of the risk of such a large position, right? People will say things like, "Oh, but the health factor is fine," and I'll say, "Well, what would be the slippage, right?" So like the current price doesn't mean much, right? So you can't just use Oracle prices to guarantee that a loan is healthy at any size. And then the question is, how do you decide what's the max you lend against any particular asset and at what interest rate? And so that gets to be a very complicated governance question. And so I think that there's a lot of interesting work there. And it's not just us. There's a lot of other groups that have been doing interesting work on governance. Like I'll shout out Gyroscope as a stable coin that has been doing cool things as far as like governance circuit breakers.
Well, actually, so before we get to can you talk about like what your group is doing and like what you think like good governance looks like, and then can you tell us what Gyroscope is doing?
My approach, which is a little bit different from what most people are working on, is focusing around on the question of like, so I was first inspired by a concept people call optimistic governance, and this came out of lots of people have worked on it, but I was introduced to it through Fey Protocol. And Tom Waite, among others, who worked on it, and I had a chance to work closely with. You have this basic concept of someone, right? We won't say who, some subset of token holders, a committee, we won't worry about that for now, can submit a proposal, and then someone else can veto it. And the idea being that instead of having everyone have to come and make a quorum to do anything, as long as there's enough of a quorum to veto dishonest proposals, you can let things chug along, right? And so you can have, you don't want to have like this is still not good if it can do like arbitrary modifications to protocol code, right? And that still demands a lot of like diligence that the average token holder cannot be expected to provide. But optimistic control over parameters, right, and certain narrowly defined and scope processes is clear to me as a obvious step forward in governance, right? Of like you have a certain quorum to modify a certain thing, and you can say, all right, you need this percent of the token supply to vote to onboard a new collateral token, this percent to vote to strike off an existing collateral token. There's this long of the voting period, and you can have various rules. And I don't think there's like a magic perfect answer, right? That's like but there's, you can have customized rule sets that suit your risk and your preferences, right? And the level of trust, like similar to rollups, where you can have different levels of decentralization or whatever that fits your own preferences. And there's many, I can see more than one, decent spot in the configuration place. I'm not saying I'm building the only right answer for that, but I think that principle is very strong and could be applied generally. And then on top of that, you can unify that to some existing things. Like, I was also inspired by like gauge style voting, where instead of everyone voting on like one thing, you can direct a certain amount of power or resources to a certain place. And so there's some concepts like that where you can, and one way that I would refer to it is, we know that there's going to be some amount of intermediation, but if you can make it trust minimized, that's the key, right? So like some people are the ones who are having more influence over the voting, or they're directing resources to a certain place, but they have skin in the game and there's veto over decisions. So the system should kind of safely wind down in the worst case and have like this kind of a rage quit or something.
Yeah, well, first of all, just quickly on the rage quit, like I'm a huge like fan of protocols designing that into their VE systems. Let's just be frank about what we're talking about here. And I think that is like, well, actually, I guess for locked LPs too. But anyway, I think that's like really smart, both in terms of like giving optionality, but also in a way that is like not only like safe for the protocol, but like actually healthy or like profitable. So huge fan of like those kind of designs. But returning to what you just said, so in my head, I'm hearing like kind of two different styles of governance. One is, I'm a huge believer that like EVM and like blockchain is cool, but that doesn't mean like we throw away everything that's happened over the last like 10,000 years of like human coordination and whatever, right? And so I think like it's really beneficial to look at models in the real world. And like the obvious model I see is like the corporate structure of board of directors, right? Where you have like this type of like ability for every single participant to like express their voice in proportion to their share. But like on the day to day and like on the like kind of like things that require like vision and executive function is like deferred to people that the community has like explicitly like lended their trust. And so I think like that's one mode of governance, and I think that like kind of fits under the optimistic government bucket that you're talking about. But kind of in my head on the other side of the spectrum is the gauge style, right? Which is like really saying like what we value is like very active governance by as many people as possible, because like we think that that's going to express something in a way that's like providing like valuable data to the protocol. And so I think like of course like those two things aren't mutually exclusive. They're both like design mechanisms that you can put into one token. But how do you first of all, can you just reflect on what I said, but also like what do you think are the types of things that are appropriate for like the more optimistic like trust approach, and what do you think is better for the like every person should engage with every vote approach?
So I think that they don't need to be separate, right? And that the question is, if you want to govern a group of humans on chain, you need the board, right? Like that's what, if you're developing software that is owned by the DAO, by people who are paid by the DAO, right? You need a board, right? Something like that, because then it's really like an on-chain corporation, and that's amazing, right? I love that because it's much better than an opaque off-chain corporation. And it's a much more even playing field for people in different jurisdictions. All these things we could get, but keeping that aside, for the gauge thing to really work well, you have to have a perfectly defined problem space, right? And understand the resource that you're allocating really well. And so for certain things, that's not so easy. It's not super easy for anything, but for some things it's impossible. And for other things, you can do it with work. And so I think that, for example, like allocating a debt ceiling in the lending market is something you can do with a gauge. But determining interest rates across all the loans in the lending market is a little bit more difficult. And so you need some things like these optimistic governance patterns. And so you have to think carefully for each type of a parameter. And I think that the kind of basic gauges, right, where you're just directing emissions, like a resource spend, right, is one thing. But even then, I have quite a few criticisms of those models, right? In terms of there not being any skin in the game, right, between what you vote for and the profits you're making. And so that's part of what I want to build into this model where, like think about how the Ava staking module works, right? You have people who can opt into risk and have skin in the game. And I think of that almost like on a per asset, but not even per asset, per lending term basis for every type of loan term that's available. Whoever's voting in the gauge is in a staking module, right, and has some kind of a skin in the game and involvement. But this core idea of like a discrete resource allocation being a source of data, 100%. I completely agree with it. And for lending markets, you can't have one board evaluate thousands or tens of thousands of different potential collaterals to say what should be the current debt ceiling right now today, right? You might be able to say what is like a toxic loan term that shouldn't be here, yes or no. But governing like exactly how much liquidity should be in each one and exactly how much rate, you need market processes for things like that. And so I think that anywhere you need to have like a market-based process, that's super interesting.
Yeah, and I definitely hear you and like very much agree that like what's so important is the problem space and like designing you're designing like your VE system in a way that is actually like achieving goals that you wanted to. And so I think like we can have a conversation about like, okay, like did it make sense for like, velodrome style or like solidly styled dexes to like flip what Curve did in a lot of ways. And that's one conversation, but another conversation is like innovations on like the gauge system. And like unfortunately I have to say that like this project like may have been a like victim of the cycles in the bear market. But are you familiar with Fiat DAO at all?
Oh yeah, closely familiar. I've met and spoken with Max quite a few times.
Yeah, and so like they used to do like a lot of good content back in like early 2022. And so one of the things that I remember them talking a lot about was like using the VE system in a new way. And like what I loved that they were talking about is basically like instead of talking about using gauges to do like emissions, it was like using gauges to basically backstop like with the insurance buffer, like different pools. And so what that does is basically like give the market more confidence that it's a less risky loan and effectively like change interest rates, but in a way that like is like really leaves the decision in the parts of the protocol that like are controllable and make sense, as opposed to like just kind of giving like the wild market like the ability to just like mess with parameters willy-nilly.
Yeah, you definitely have to watch out with manipulation risk in any of these kind of things, of course. And I like that model a lot. And the other curveball I'll just throw out is that it doesn't necessarily have to be VE, right? Like instead of calling it, because VE is really makes people think about a time lock, but the goal I don't think should be making people lock up their tokens for some duration, but rather coupling the lock of their tokens to the risk of whatever decision they're making, right? So make sure that like if you're casting a vote, let's say, and I'll get a little more concrete for our specific system because I think that's more interesting. Is that let's say that you're voting, and for those listening, just think about a MakerDAO style system where you have different vaults types that can borrow under different terms, right? So you have your own individual debt position, and so that'll be just the analogy we're working under that's familiar for people. But then imagine instead of the existing Maker governance, you instead have these kind of gauges that are allocating this debt ceiling, and the idea would just be that if the debt ceiling that you have voted with is utilized, right? Like you have voted a debt ceiling towards a certain asset and someone is currently borrowing, you could only unstake from that gauge if there's enough unutilized debt ceiling, right? So then you can't go and unvote once you voted and someone then borrowed until they repay their loan. And then you will receive interest from that. And also you could unstake and you can imagine someone else might be willing to come in and stake on year one, and then you could unstake, that kind of thing. But the idea should be that the lock should be coupled to the ramifications of your decision. And you shouldn't be able to like walk away clean, like stake, vote, and then unstake and leave, and then the risk hits the protocol. So if you can couple it towards the decision you're actually making, and also give you rewards specific to that decision, I think that is a design ideal. And that's probably different for for a DEX, it might be something like, oh, you escrow it for like a week or a month or something, and then based on the trading rewards that have been received on that pair, you either get a reward or a slash, right? Because it's basically, we're saying, hey, make an honest prediction of the yield on this pair. And if you're just getting like bribed and taking your own profits, that's great, but we're going to slash you a little bit to be like a base fee. You know, like you could have however you want to do it. And I think that for different types of protocols, there's anything that is like directly handling money in a very mathematical way. I think it makes sense to do this. For things like ENS, right, it would be different, right? And it makes much more sense to have like a board or a foundation for other types of structures. But for it's a very mathematical lending market or exchange, having tight coupling between the decisions and a financial outcome makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, man, my like wheels are spinning just thinking about everything you're throwing out here. And you know, like for anyone that's like feeling a little uncomfortable with the idea of matching the like your staked Aave, right, with like duration of the loan, it's like that we do the same thing with the collateral, like because we have to, right? Or no, sorry, not the collateral, like the assets that you have loaned.
The lenders in the market are potentially stuck, right? So why shouldn't the governors be in the same boat?
I don't know how you would encode this, but on a philosophical level, if anything, they should be taking more risk.
Yes, and we definitely interpret it the same as Maker, right? Where that token is supposed to be the first loss, and we don't have the exact same. There's lots of people, and this is kind of an aside, but there's lots of people who have written interesting things about kind of the economics of the Maker emergency auction and also Maker buy and burn, and kind of critiquing them. Hasu has some interesting things on that, and also in the light of this potential, Aave V2 bad debt that might result from the curve position, people have been talking about how the Aave staking module works and kind of reviving interest in that. And it's clear that trying to sell your governance token in an emergency is not a great idea, right? It's not going to make you a ton of money. But Maker also has this concept, and Aave have a concept of reserves or the surplus buffer, right? Where they have this accrued profit from lending. And so if you understand the governance token as like a share of those reserves, right, that's what they're directing around when they're staking. And part of the idea of the lending market should be like, you don't want to have those reserves leave the protocol early on because you should be growing, right? You want to be always growing the reserves. And one of the criticisms of MakerDAO is that this buy and burn, and even Rune now has pushed to stop the buy and burn and accumulate, strategic reserves like ETH now. But for a long time, they bought and burnt a bunch of Maker at the top, and then they had to sell it off at the bottom in an emergency, and they ended up losing a bunch of money. So, and I think Aave would be in the same boat if they had a staking module loss now, but they've had more time they have accumulated a decent amount of reserves, right? And they can use reserves from multiple markets if they need to. So that helps. And so I think that lending markets should think a lot about just like better infrastructure for how the reserves pay off bad debt and how bad debt is marked down. And I guess that's one other topic I would highlight as being of great interest to me is what happens when the worst happens, right? How do the lending markets perform when they fail? And I can tell you guys we can talk about interesting stories from what we've seen, like, Vault Protocol had integrated Fuse on the, when the Fuse hack occurred. And so I had a front row seat to having to, not just front row seat, but was, responding in the...
For the audience, the Fuse hack is better known as the Rari hack.
Yeah, and I distinguished that because Rari had, there was actually more than one Rari hack. And so there was a Rari accelerator that was hacked prior. So I try to be technical in that regard. Because the real history is when Faye and Rari merged, part of the deal was the loss from the previous Rari hack being paid off by the Tribe DAO. So there's some interesting things like that.
No, very cool. And I think just to like tie a bow on what you were just talking about in terms of like using your own token to defend or using your own token in emergency situations, it's like, look, I understand why it was architected this way, and the reality is it's because like you have nothing else to sell in that moment. But just to not recognize that the moments when you need to sell the token to raise funds are going to be the moment when the market has the most questions about your protocol, and therefore you're going to get the lowest prices, is like, it's a recipe for disaster. It is a literal recipe for like selling low and like taking on bad debt. And so, again, like this is the nature of innovation. Like we all like have to take from like we stand on the shoulders of giants, and like thank you giants for taking the licks for us.
Yeah, a whole tower of giants at this point.
So while we're like still in this maker world, I would love to like just hear your thoughts and reflections on what Maker is going through in terms of like this transformation. And like, if you want, we can talk about the like politics and like the end game of it all and whatever. But like, to me, all of that's like noise. And like, what's more interesting is just like watching the one of like the OG DeFi protocols like really make a legitimate attempt to like reach off chain and like create a hybrid business that straddles both. And I'm wondering if you agree with that characterization, and if you do, like, how do you think that's going? And do you think it's a good thing?
Well, that's a good set of questions. Well, let me take that from the end. Do I think it's a good thing? Yes. Do I think it is going well? Not as much, right? So like conceptually, I think it's a good thing, but I'm less convinced on the execution. And so, and again, not to get too much into the internal maker politics, but it is noteworthy that this push into real world assets was initially driven by a group of contributors in MakerDAO that have since been driven out. And basically Rune is still continuing that same vision in a way, and that's what's interesting, right? Is that MakerDAO is still pursuing this path towards being real world asset heavy in a sense, but now with kind of this defensive mindset, maybe even paranoid mindset, which is a little bit different. And so I'm going to give basically the good and the bad of both, and to give a fully balanced answer. And so the bad of how things were before Rune came back in was that there was not enough fear of God in everyone, right, as far as risk. And
To provide my like little piece of the story in this, so as I was first getting into crypto at the end of 2021, I applied for a job for MakerDAO, and it was as part of like, it was under Sebastian. It was like part of the like strategic analytics, something like that. But like all of my interviews were with like the real world assets people, and like I was from the real world finance, so I think like that's just who they had me talking to. And to me, like the biggest like takeaway I had was just like, oh my god, does anybody know what anybody else is working on? And like this just seems like a huge blob. And so anyway, I'll let you continue, but that was just like my impression from getting rejected from a job there.
no, that's absolutely right. So there was too many disorganized groups and a lot of wasteful expenditure going on, and also just things like inconsistent management of asset risk and interest rate pricing, other shenanigans. But there was an organized direction towards fixing these problems, and so some people within strategic finance were cleanly aware of these things and frequently highlighted them. And there was a push by certain maker holders to think about something like a maker constitution and a board. And there was debate about this, right? Some people said, no, we shouldn't change it, right? And so it wasn't clear where it would go. I'm not implying that there was a clear consensus that was disrupted, but from my point of view, there were credible proposals towards a beneficial direction and starting to, grow the surplus buffer and have, more sophisticated management of the PSMs and liquidity. And though the problems were acknowledged, I think that progress was slow because there was no central leader who had strong control over the organization. But what I've seen since is that kind of the opposite, right? Where I feel like now, well, it's got to the point where Rune effectively has unilateral control over Maker, in that they've enshrined a program where like you have to be anon to be a delegate. And so most of the experienced delegates are being have already departed, along with a lot of the experienced teams at the DAO. And you have a situation where Rune can like more or less just push votes through by himself. I don't know exactly how many tokens he controls or through intermediaries, but even what he publicly controls is huge. And it's very difficult for anyone to do anything different. So then the more interesting question becomes, well, what's Rune's vision, right? What is Maker Rune's vision going to be like? Because it's not all bad, but there are things that concern me, and mostly it's just that I feel that there are certain examples of extreme and unrealistic thinking, and like not what I would consider to be sober risk analysis or cost benefit analysis going on. But at the same time, there are decisive changes being made for the good. Things just like simplifying the overall, the goal of paring down the overall organization and centralizing it around a unified objective is absolutely correct. But when I see what's happened, I see talent loss, and I see a strategy that is not necessarily risk minimized in the way that I would like to see from Maker.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that I don't say this with any like humor or as a joke. Like I mean it seriously. Like it's the dictator's dilemma, right? It is like this is like an energetic person who has a vision can like really like tighten things up and bring like a massive like blob into this like tight organization that can really like affect change and do things. But like the flip side of that is like like dictators, like whether it's because like they can't stand other people like sharing control, or it's because like competent people like want to have real responsibility and real input, like they end up like pushing away like their real sources of like feedback and like information and like just like what makes like an organization stronger than a leader. And so you know that we're Maker seems like it's like living and dying on like Rune, and just like be aware that that's what it is now.
And the other just note of caution that I would give to people is that if there's one thing I've taken away from building in this space, it's that complex new systems are very scary from a smart contract security perspective. And like both Ava and Compound have had bugs slip through that accidentally froze markets in the last year. And that's scary. And it certainly, when I hear about things like in the endgame plan and all these sub DAOs and new structures, new synthetic assets, I think, whoa, I would be nervous, right? And I'm just hopeful that they won't make too many alterations in the existing core protocol and will remain conservative. But that's one of the hardest things for the average end user to evaluate risk about in a DeFi protocol, right? Smart contract risk. And so just be wary when you see changes happening, right? A lot of new things going on like that, that it's not, the Lindy factor that you may think it has can erode. And so that's what I am most concerned with, because like people are very worried about like USDC risk or a particular like monetalis collateral. I'm less concerned, right? I think that MakerDAO, its current collateral basket and current size are unlikely to result in problems. My issue is with their direction at scale, right? If they were to grow 10 times on the path that they're going, I think that they could get into a lot of trouble. But smart contract risk can strike at any time. And so definitely I'm going to be keeping a keen eye on that. And am honestly thinking that the culture, and others have said this as well, that the culture about security in DeFi just needs to change and be more collaborative. And so part of what I hope is that more people will do more building in public early, and do more peer scrutiny and review of each other's code. So there's just a shout out to anyone who's listening and interested in that we would love to, of course, have limited time, but would love to provide peer code reviews and also to get peer code reviews of what we're working on, and would encourage like that to be more of a thing. Like it's not enough to get one or two external audit teams who don't have deep skin in the game and then just like one, it's hard to be assured. But if you think about the kind of practices that they do in aeronautics and other extreme security applications in other software fields, it's common to have a whole separate team that writes tests without even looking at the code, right? You get the same spec to the code team and the test team, and they make it, and at the end the code has to pass the tests. And I've had, I have friends that went to school with me who went to JPL and have told me about all this, and I think if we're writing code that aspires to be immutable, that's going to secure millions or billions of dollars over time, then that's the least that we can do. And so we can try to do that internally, but it's a big burden on everyone who's a researcher or developer to have all that testing and security infrastructure in-house. So I think that a culture of peer review and basically normalizing that it should be considered absurd and reckless to submit a governance update to a major DAO without getting it signed off on by like the operators of its major competitors as well, right? Like Compound and Ava Dev should run each proposal by each other publicly. Like, why don't they? And a lot of things like that seems like it would be just like a cultural norm that could be enshrined. Where like you can't publish an article in a scientific journal without like a randomly selected set of reviewers, right? How could a DAO sign off on a proposal without the similar scrutiny that was managed in a very public way? And of course they have, they contract with security shops, but I just feel that it's not the same thing to have purely outside security professionals who only come in occasionally, and episodically.
Well, look, I mean, I think everything you're saying here, like, is like we have a couple problems here. One is like we have an auditing industry, but like we have an auditing industry that like we have like actors like Surtech, who like is a well-known meme that if you get audited by Surtech, you're like 1 week maximum away from getting hacked. Like that, like that is the fact that that is tolerated is a reflection of like the fact that we're not taking any of this seriously yet. I think like peer review and everything you're talking about is great, and I think you just covered kind of two things there. One is like on the code side, and one is on the like just like responsibility in like decision making side with DAO proposals. And you know, I think at like the kind of like dirty underbelly of this whole conversation is like this whole thing is predicated on the idea that you think that one thinks that DAOs are like really good faith organizations that are like trying to like make decisions in concert over the internet by using this new technology, and not like a way to issue like unregistered securities that you can use as exit liquidity in a way that like people can't track that like where the money's going and like the how many people are involved in like that kind of thing. And so you know, I think like there's a lot of like hairy questions in our industry, and a lot of like things that like really need to be like identified, and like we as a community need to excise and like say we will not tolerate. I think there's a lot of things that we need to have like really good like good natured like energetic debates, because there's not a right answer, and I think there's like best practices that are already like appearing and that we like should be skating towards. And I think it's a big all hairy mess, but you know, while we just have like 10 or so minutes left of this conversation, I'd love to just kind of like pivot like away from like what is, and like look more at what's coming. And so like within the context of like lending markets and like the things that you're working on and like governance, like as you look forward, whether it's new like protocols or designs or like technologies that are going to be enabled, like what is really like getting you excited, and yeah, what is getting you excited about the future in an era that it's hard to even get out of bed knowing that we're in this industry?
Well, at least for me, it's hard to stay in bed, both because of the exciting things I'm learning about and because I have a baby at home. But as far as what's coming up, what's really caught my fancy recently is the idea that so people have been focused on generalized scaling for a long time in the Ethereum context. But I've begun to ask myself things like, well, how can I push the limits within specifically where I'm working? And that has led me to understand things in slightly different ways. One example would be like, so normally for a roll up like Arbitrum or Optimism, you have this kind of canonical bridge, right? Where you send, you know, if you need to send, and that's also the sequencer selector, right? You know, it's the contract where state updates are posted and where you send funds if you want to send them to the roll up. We can call it whatever we want. I don't care. Bridge, gateway, proposer, hub, anything. And this is where all of the non-native assets of that rollup are. And it also presumably is coupled with the state root of the rollup. So this native assets are there too, right? And especially for non-native assets, like all the ETH that might be on rollups, it's just sitting there doing nothing, right? Like it's whatever position you might have on the rollup, from the perspective of mainnet, the ETH is sitting there idle in that contract doing nothing at all.
So just to like really drill home that point, like what you're saying is today, let's say there's a million ETH on Arbitrum, but from the perspective of Ethereum, that's just like 1 million ETH sitting in one smart contract, not moving, just ETH in a contract.
Not able to be used to validate or anything of interest, right? But you might ask yourself, well, what if, you know, it's a hot topic is eigenlayer. What if in some kind of rocket pool-like mechanism, stakers could bid to get in on some of that ETH, right? And stake that ETH and use it to validate, but without it ever leaving that contract, right? Because the rules for that staking, so it's basically like a wrapped, in the same way that when you staked ETH via rocket pool or other truly decentralized staking pools, it has to pass through some kind of a gateway, right? So if you're running a rocket pool node, and you posted some ETH collateral, you can't get your own ETH back without also returning the ETH from the our ETH holders that they provided. And so you can do a same sort of thing here, where you can do collateralized. But to me, while eigenlayer is cool, I have it's like it's all over collateralization meme. Like the restaking, we use that term because it's ETH, right? But if you we actually have a word for that in TradFi, which is rehypothecation, right? Whether it doesn't matter if it's ETH or USDC or Uni token or anything, right? Any token that you deposit in the rollup contract that's doing something on L2, but it doesn't mean it has to be idle on L1. And so we can start thinking about interesting things we can do, not only restaking, but also like lending markets where you can simultaneously be using the same liquidity on L1 and L2. And I'll shout out someone else who's doing related work. There's something called the distributed AMM or the DAMM that I believe comes out of the Starknet context, where it's like you can have one pool, but it allows multiple contracts to have trade at separate. I don't want to mangle the explanation of how that works too much, but I would encourage anyone who's interested to look at the way that they allow the same liquidity to be traded against from multiple consensus layers. But this is sort of the opposite, right? Because I'm saying, oh, well, what if we're not worried about what's happening on L2, right? But we're saying, what if that funds that is on L2, without worrying at all about what it's being used for or who currently owns it on L2, could be earning yield, and then that could go to all of the people who are on the L2.
For anyone who's like hearing this and just being like, oh my god, like we are such degens, like things are so crazy, like how can you like be layering risk like this? I mean, like at the very most basic, it's like Arbitrum could just swap all the ETH in that smart contract into staked ETH, right? And then like at like then that ETH like is backed. Everything that's on the L2 is backed. Like it can always be like redeemed 1-for-1 for, staked ETH, or Arbitrum can do that, like can do the swap for you or the redemption for you. But like in the meantime, like Arbitrum can like be like gathering new ETH, and they can distribute that to, people on their roll up. They can use that as a buffer. They can like, anything. But like, man, like this is like an incredible just like idea and insight, and just like if you know me, you know that I like am a big believer in eigenlayer, and like not even necessarily in like the company, although I'm a big believer in Sriram, but like I'm a big believer in the paradigm and the idea and like the transformation and what it means for like Ethereum and smart assets. But man, this like you just opened it up like way more. Like why? I mean, this is even more basic. So man, like mind blown.
Well, good. I'm glad that interests you, because I've definitely been spinning with all the possibilities, and it all started off just asking the question like, how could a lending market have a fungible debt unit on multiple scaling layers, and how do you handle things like bad debt getting safely reported? And I started to realize, well, it's very difficult unless you can tightly couple the state on L1 to the state on L2 in the bridge contract. But I realized if you can do that, there's all kinds of things that you might be able to do that are interesting. And so I think that one example of the significance of the funds that are on the bridge contract being borrowable are that normally on a roll-up, it's very common that the prices of assets won't be exactly the same as on mainnet, right? Because of the the withdrawal delay, mostly. And there's bridges, but that you can't get around the fact that final settlement does have to occur with mainnet, and so there'll always be some kind of anytime there's a meaningful imbalance in demand to hold certain assets on the roll-up versus mainnet, there'll be price deviations. And well, I thought, well, if you can borrow funds from the roll-up, that means that you could do something like this, right? Let's say that ETH on the roll-up is trading at a premium to ETH on mainnet. Oh, sorry, let me do that the other way around. ETH on the roll-up is trading at a discount to ETH on mainnet because people are trying to exit the roll-up. But what they're not really trying to get off the roll-up. They're actually just trying to sell ETH. Right, there's net sales of ETH. They would be fine to stay on the roll-up as long as they could hold stablecoins, and so they're dumping ETH for stables on the roll-up. And so normally we would have to wait and say, okay, someone is going to have to move stablecoins from mainnet to the roll-up and buy roll-up ETH so that they to close that arbitrage, and then they're going to have to wait for the withdrawal delay to withdraw that roll-up ETH back to mainnet to close the loop. And so they have to wait that, and the degree of capital that's willing to do that delay defines the price deviation people will actually see. But the question is, what if instead of waiting like that, I could go ahead and provide USDC to the rollup on L1, right, on the L1 contract, not bridged yet, right, but provide it to the L1 contract, and then borrow ETH from the rollup on L1 and use that to lever up my position enough to fully satisfy the demand on that roll up to swap from ETH to USDC. And then after all that's done, I can bridge my whole debt position onto the roll up. And so I can then go ahead and sell all that USDC for roll up ETH and close my debt position out. And so I can do a leveraged arbitrage, but settle it quick. And so I'll still have to wait to get my full profits off, but I don't have to wait to close the arbitrage, right? And so I can close my debt position and just wait to get my money. And so there's lots of things kind of like that we might be able to imagine for different types of applications. And like, I haven't thought about this fully in the DEX or exchange space, but I imagine that there are things that are very interesting within order settlement and swaps within the same kind of thinking.
For sure, for sure. And I think like on the one hand, like the introduction of ZK and ZK rollups like ruins that like specific arbitrage you just talked about. But on the other side, like completely changes what's possible because of like the instantaneous communication, the instantaneous trustless communication between the different layers, like is like really going to transform what we're even talking about here. So I wish we could go on forever, but unfortunately, like we got to keep it to an hour. What this does mean is like, Kirk, we got to get you back on. And we didn't, for those of you listening at home, we didn't even start talking about the original purpose of this this conversation, which is like Ethereum scaling and the Ethereum roadmap. So Kirk, I hope I'll see you again soon. And before I head out, like, can you just share with the audience where they can find you, if you can share the name of the project you're working on, and just like where people can learn more about the things that you're interested in?
Well, you can find me anywhere you care to as OneTrueKirk. Twitter's the best place. Feel free to tweet at me, and I'm always very happy to talk shop. And thank you so much for you having me. It's a real pleasure. I work remote, and my colleagues are also all remote, so it's always nice to just connect with people who are sincere, enthusiasts who know about what matters in the space and are trying to learn more about it and drive it forward. So anyone, please don't be shy. And the project, I originally built what we called Volt Protocol. We deprecated the V1, and we're now calling the successor the Ethereum Credit Guild, a little bit aligned with the immutable Ethereum values too. I was originally started just cold tweeting at people, and it's thanks to the grace of people who have talked to me and helped me. And you meet people that I'm able to work on this full time now. So please, if you're listening and that's you and you're, I'm very happy to have a call and help anyone any way I can.
Well, excuse me. Wow, Kirk. Well, thank you so much. And again, I hope to see you soon back on this pod.
Yep, same to you, and hope to get the chance to buy you a coffee or a beer in person one of these days.
No, I will definitely make sure that happens, but I will be buying the beer.
Okay, well, we could take turns.
Yeah, we'll fight about it.
All
right, man. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon.